You're listening to The Heart of You on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, please join us on Patreon.
Welcome back to The Heart of You. This is Annette Deleu. I am your host, and today we have a very special episode celebrating one of my favorite holidays, which is Halloween. So happy Halloween, happy Samhain, and happy autumn. I was in Germany not too long ago, and I was wandering around a really tiny little village called Runkel. And it was recommended to me by a friend of mine. I was there for a wedding. I decided to go to this beautiful castle. It is a high Middle Ages castle. If any of you are following me on my personal Instagram, which if you would like to, it's at Annette Deleu. I am a huge fan of castles. Love, love, love castles. So this one was particularly interesting because a lot of the history was still very much intact. So there were a lot of displays of armor and a lot of the guns and things that had been used over the course of time. And they had built a newer portion of the castle when the older portion, which was built back in the Middle Ages, was for the most part destroyed during the 30 Years' War. So as I was doing my little tour of the castle, I came across one room that was rather small and dark, and it was in the older portion of the castle. And it was clear that this was some sort of torture chamber, torture room. It had a stockade and, shackles on the walls and that sort of thing. I was reading the brochure in English, which was rather small, and so it didn't have a lot of information, but the one piece of information it had was that this torture chamber was used during the witch trials in 1649 through 1652. Now, if you have ever gotten an Akashic record reading, you may know or may have realized that many light workers who are incarnated at this time were in fact victims of witch trials during that time. The witch trials took place a much longer period of time than most people believe. Especially if you grew up in the United States, you hear about the Salem witch trials, which took place between 1692 and 1693, and 200 people were accused of practicing witchcraft, and 20 of those people were executed. Now, that is, of course, horrible. But if you compare it to what was happening in what is now present-day Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and Hungary, between 1300 and 1850, the witch trials continued throughout all of those centuries, and there were more executions in those countries than the rest of the world combined. It's hard to say exactly because there were a lot of executions here in France as well, but they were not very accurately recorded. But it is said that in the European region, there were upwards of 40,000 executions for being a witch. And 70 to 80% of those executions were women. The rest were men and children. Now, you might ask, why am I talking about history? This is a spirituality podcast. Well, I mean, you should know by now that because I am an Akashic record reader, history is very fascinating to me, and I very much love reading into what has happened in the past from what I've seen in the Akashic records versus what is written down in history. And this is a really big one because I started seeing the witch trial experiences pretty early on in doing sessions for clients, because a lot of the time that is where a lot of trauma can be lodged in that particular lifetime. And of course, if that trauma isn't addressed on a soul level, then that can have an incredible impact on your lives moving forward from the trauma point. So from the time that you were in the witch trials and then moving forward throughout the rest of your lifetimes, there could be elements that are there in terms of making you stuck, or there could be blockages, or there could be all kinds of things going on. Some of the things that I've seen in client sessions have been really incredible. And I first got a glimpse at this actually looking into my own records. One of the biggest traumas that I was starting to work through, I couldn't really understand why I was dealing with some particular issues. And when I finally went into the records and saw that I, in fact, was one of those people who were practicing witchcraft back then, and I did not get caught. I did not go to trial. There was nothing. I was able to escape, and I was able to do it because I was crafty. And quite frankly, I used my powers for not great things. And so there was a lot of that self-forgiveness that I needed to do in order to move past some of those blockages. The other lesson I needed to learn in that was to not use my power for personal gain, for taking shortcuts and that sort of thing. There has been an incredible theme in this lifetime for me, and that has been patience. So I've often wondered why I always have to have so much patience, and I always seem to be waiting a very long time for a lot of things. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why, is because I was taking so many shortcuts and basically abusing my power. And so now that I am able to know exactly how to use the powers that I have and use them to benefit people and to help others and to serve communities and to serve the greatest good for this giant spiritual awakening that everybody is having or is going to have. So you might be asking yourself, okay, so it sounds a little fantastical that, you know, there were witches back then and that they had powers and that sort of thing. And it's pretty easy to find very concrete evidence within history that it was very commonplace for most kings and queens to have a seer that would be a consultant that they would talk to before making decisions or something to that effect. The practice, it's not something that was uncommon and it wasn't unusual. The problem came for two reasons. So in history, you can see that when the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church were fighting for followers, so to speak, that is actually when the executions seem to spike. Okay, so if you look at the history of when the big spikes of executions happened, it seemed to be in a period of time with great agitation between the Protestant and Catholic churches. There are a lot of interesting little nuances in regards to what was happening politically, as well as with each of the religions, and why the witch trials happened when they did. Now, the interesting part that you don't see in history, and the part that I have seen in the Akashic Records, is the fact that when you talk about the ascension, you talk about us going on this spiritual awakening journey as we are currently, it is about us being able to unlock our spiritual gifts. It's not like the divine just gives them to you. You always have them within you, but of course, we always have that veil of forgetfulness that we incarnate with, so we're not able to remember the things that we need to remember. So we have to work through a lot of trauma. We have to work through a lot of pain and lower energies in order to get to those higher energies so we can access those spiritual gifts. Now, that's how it operates now, but that's not how it always operated. When we talk about what happened back then and what I have seen in the records, back in the 1300s, probably maybe a little bit earlier than that, they don't always give me concrete dates, but they give me, you know, a visual of what was happening at that time. So I can assume based on what they were showing me. Maybe between 1200 and 1300 was a time where the universe was like, okay, cool. So let's take all of the light workers who are going to be helping with Gaia's ascension process, who are going to be helping with Earth's ascension, and we're just going to give that ability to remove that veil of forgetfulness. We're going to give that ability to all of the light workers on the planet, and let's see what happens. And I know that sounds weird. It sounds like a weird experiment, but in a way it kind of was, because divine source energy was saying, okay, we need to make sure that the humans will be able to access these gifts. And what better way than to just give them that remembrance and see how they handle it. As you can imagine, some people handled it beautifully. Some people used their gifts to help heal people, to help advise. Like I said, kings and queens, they helped advise people and, made tinctures and herbal medicines and really helped communities. And they did really, really good work. And then there were some people that got really scared and they couldn't understand what was happening to them. Of course, I can only speculate, but it brings to mind the story about Abigail Williams, who is one of the children that was in the Salem witch trials. And she's described as having fits and screaming peculiar sounds. Yes, some of that, maybe the poor girl was having a seizure. Maybe she was an epileptic. Maybe some of the sounds that were coming out, maybe she was actually having her light language activated. Because when light language is spoken, it sounds like you're speaking complete gibberish. It sounds like you're saying something that is some sort of ancient language that nobody remembers. And if you're curious about light language and you don't know what that is, head to one of the earlier podcast episodes. I interview a wonderful woman named Maria, and she actually gives a demonstration of light language. So just as a side note there. So then, of course, you have the people who maybe didn't use their powers for good. And like I said, I was one of those people, sadly. We all have stuff that we've done in our past that has been not fantastic. So yeah, there were plenty of people out there that were actually able to use their gifts and they abused the power. And it's interesting because a lot of what I have seen is that there are many people who were accused of being a witch, and they're saying to me roughly 70% of the people accused were in fact not even people who were light workers who actually had their gifts. The patriarchy, the people in power at the time, decided to use the witch trials as a means to basically get rid of people who they either didn't like or thought were immoral, whatever that happened to be. So it is very well known that they would torture people who were gay or women who had had abortions or women who simply were in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's a lot of conjecture, but ultimately that really didn't matter because whatever person in power decided that they didn't like somebody or they didn't like what somebody was doing, then all of a sudden they were on the list and then they were being tortured into confessing that they were practicing witchcraft. So a lot of people actually ended up confessing to it, even though they didn't. It was because they just couldn't take the torture anymore. I find it incredibly interesting that a lot of and I'm going to speak of Catholic practices specifically because I grew up Catholic, but a lot of Catholic practices are actually rooted in pagan traditions, which are much older than Catholicism. For example, they will have incense, frankincense, and myrrh, all of those things that have that beautiful smell, like the church smell when you walk in. And, that's essentially clearing energy. We use incense, we use sage, we use Palo Santo to clear our spaces and clear ourselves. And essentially that is exactly what the priest is doing when he is using the frankincense in church. I love Paris for all of its myriad of options of things to do throughout each and every day. However, it can get a little overwhelming sometimes to figure out what you want to do because there's so much to do. If you're in this position, I highly recommend you listen to Don't Miss This with Jennifer Garrity. She gives you the best of what is going on in Paris for each particular week. It is definitely something I listen to every Sunday, so go and check it out at parisundergroundradio.com. We will be right back with The Heart of You after a word from our sponsors. Welcome back to The Heart of You on Paris Underground Radio. There's also something that is called transubstantiation, which is sort of a way of describing what the ritual of taking the Eucharist or the body of Christ, if you will. If you are in a church, you will receive a Eucharist that is supposed to be the consecrated body of Jesus Christ. So it is essentially eating, it's like a cannibalistic representation of eating the body of your deity. And this is a practice that was around back in 3100 BC in Egypt, when they used to consecrate cakes to become flesh with the god Osiris. So, there's a lot of rituals within religions nowadays that are incredibly steeped in ancient traditions and ancient lore. And so it's not that these things that the magistrates and the kings and all the people that were involved in the witch trials, it's not like this was something new and they're like, oh my gosh, this is a threat to religion. No, this has been going on for thousands of years. It's just they just decided at this time that it would benefit them to be able to sort of take advantage of this particular situation as it has unfolded. So because there was this veil of forgetfulness that was sort of removed from the light workers, the amount of people that were able to see the future, that were able to heal with plant medicines and things like that, obviously the number of people increased exponentially between 1200 and, moving forward through the witch trials. Because if you think about it, if you have a whole bunch of people, and it wasn't just women, there were men as well, had these abilities to not only predict the future potentially with some accuracy, but they were also able to do all of the things that we are now just starting to understand. That was a threat to anyone who was in power, because if you have power, that is a threat to the people who have insecurely taken the power for themselves. And it's interesting because as we move forward on this spiritual awakening process, the more people who start to awaken and start to embark on this spiritual journey, it feels like the more resistance there happens to be. That is natural. It's a natural reaction to people basically not understanding something, to people saying, that scares me because it potentially threatens my way of life. And what they're not realizing, and what they didn't realize back then, is that it wasn't a threat to their way of life. It was actually something that would improve their way of life if they were only able to open their ears and listen. Now, of course, like I said, there were other people that really shut down their gifts because they were so afraid of what was happening to them and they didn't understand it. And so a lot of my clients who I've seen that with have had a lot of blocks in regards to their spiritual gifts in this lifetime. So if you are one of those people that really genuinely feels like your gifts are blocked, then that might be something that we could take a look at to see if maybe you had some fears surrounding your gifts back in that time period. Now, just because your gifts have not come into play yet, that doesn't necessarily mean you have a block either, because sometimes our gifts are sort of held back from us a little bit. Trust me, like I said about the patience earlier in this episode, I've had to have a lot of patience in my life in regards to that. So I was given information years and years ago that I would be doing Akashic record work, but it just wasn't coming to fruition. And so I often wondered, I was like, well, if this is what I'm supposed to be doing, like, why is it not coming together? The reason why is because there were a lot of other things that I needed to purge. I needed to clear my vessel, so to speak, and clear all the debris from my soul in order to be able to clearly see everything that I need to see and help others. I'm sure you've heard this expression, and, this kind of goes hand in hand with the first episode of this season, which is about codependency. But you cannot help other people if your cup is empty. If you are operating from an empty cup or a cup that is filled with negativity, you're not going to be able to help other people. So you really do need to go through a lot of that spiritual healing and that spiritual work in order to be able to have your gifts come into that bright, beautiful sunshine, and to be able to use them with ease, and to be able to use them in the way that your soul wants you to use them. That was the portion of people who really didn't understand their gifts and really had a lot of fears surrounding it. Now, the fears were very much rooted in religion. The fears are very much rooted in the devil, and witchcraft is often associated with Satan and the devil and all of those things. I've said this before in previous podcasts. I say it constantly just because it really bears repeating. There is no devil. There is no Satan. It doesn't exist. Basically, the evil that you are sort of taught or that has been expressed to you it's a fear tactic. And so what is evil? Well, evil is a person who decides to do something that is against love. It is against their humanity, against their own soul. I mean, that's basically what evil is. So it's not some person or some entity that is making you do something. You're making the free will choice to do it based on whatever information you have. Now, can this be something that is influenced by other people or by other entities or things like that? Sure, it can be influenced, but you are still making the free will decision. So that is something that you have to keep in mind when you have other past lives that you're looking into, that, maybe you've done things, maybe you've been a murderer, maybe you've been a horrible person, maybe you've been a person who enslaved people. Whatever it is that you have done in your past lives, again, there is no judgment because we've all been there, we've all done it, and we've all had those experiences. And we are now sitting here as light workers being able to rise above everything that we have experienced in the oftentimes thousands of lifetimes that we've had. We are able to move forward in this spiritual ascension process. Here's another bit of information about those experiences that we have in past lives, such as being born during a time where there are witch trials. So you will often hear me say that we choose the experiences that we have in any given lifetime. So not only do we choose it on a soul level, but then on a human level, we also choose a lot of the experiences that we have. And that is based on our energy. It's based on what we're manifesting. It's based on a lot of things. That is not necessarily true all the time. So we're talking about the big traumas, the, murders, the rapes, things like that, torture, all of those horrible things that happen. Do some people sign up for those? Yeah, they do actually. I know it sounds horrible and you may say I would never do that, but a lot of people do sign up for those types of experiences because it cracks you open. It makes you realize certain things that you would not have realized otherwise. It makes you learn certain lessons. And yes, it's happened to all of us. Just as we have all been sort of quote unquote evil people, we have all had various forms of torture. We've all had various forms of death experiences. During these witch trials, though, in the very beginning, what I've seen in the Akashic Records, if you were one of the light workers that received your gifts early on, so let's say from the 1200s to the 1300s, maybe going into like 1350, then you did not necessarily sign up for what happened with the witch trials. But after that, because they went on for so long, actually light workers decided to incarnate again and again during that time because they wanted to get it right. They wanted to see if they would make a different decision next time. So let's say if you were one of those people who didn't use your gifts for good and you crossed over, your soul basically was like, all right, well, let's try that again and let's see if I can get it right this time. So some of the light workers may have incarnated multiple times during the time frame that the witch trials took place, in which case you may have had multiple lifetimes in there. I, however, did not. And I think it's mainly because of the fact that I did not go through a traumatic death. There were a lot of things that I did not experience, but I did in fact have a lot of that karma, if you will. I don't like using the word karma because it has other indications that I would be paid back for what I did, but that's not how karma works. Karma is essentially allowing yourself to forgive yourself for the things that you have done. It's about not placing judgment on decisions you made in previous lifetimes and being able to start with a clean slate if you can. And it's unfortunately not very easy for very many souls to be able to do that, because you then need to clear all of that sort of psychic debris and all of the debris from the previous lifetime. And sometimes that can take several lifetimes. I have yet to come across somebody where they have shown me multiple lifetimes where they had incarnated during witch trials. I know it exists because they have shown that to me, but oftentimes it's not going to make a difference if you see both lifetimes or 3 lifetimes where you were in witch trials or that you were incarnated during that time. Most of the time, it's probably the last lifetime that you were in that scenario that was probably the most important, or whichever lifetime has the most weight that you need to clear. So oftentimes they're not going to show me all of the lifetimes, they're just going to show me one. One of the other scenarios that I have not seen anything written about in history is that there were certain people of power that were conducting witch trials, but then also were keeping witches tied up in their basements, in their dungeons, for their own personal use. When they actually were able to find one of the light workers, one of the people who were practicing witchcraft, whatever you want to call it, they actually were not always as pious as they purported to be. If they found somebody who was very, very well versed in their gifts and somebody who was able to foresee the future and heal and do all of those beautiful things, they would essentially keep them for their own use. And so it backfired on many of them, actually, because what happened was, in keeping the person, whoever it was, locked up in the basement, they were able to then place curses or do whatever they needed to do to finally escape. And most of them did escape. Are you trying to manifest your dream of moving to Paris? If you are, I would highly recommend listening to the Paris Estate of Mind podcast. It is right here on Paris Underground Radio, and it will give you everything that you need to know about renting apartments in the City of Light. We will be right back with the Heart of You after a word from our sponsors. Welcome back to the Heart of You on Paris Underground Radio. All right, so that brings us to curses. I often talk about curses in the Akashic Records because it is something that I do clear on a pretty regular basis. You may have heard me describe curses as words said in extreme anger, which is most of the time that I see a curse, that is pretty much what we're talking about, is that you are saying something in extreme anger to somebody or they're saying it to you. From this particular time frame, curses were a bit stronger because of the power that was behind them. So if you can imagine all of us light workers right now being able to have instant manifestation abilities, it was kind of like that. Now, it wasn't instant at the time, but it was pretty close to instant. It was, within minutes, hours, days, as opposed to when we manifest something now, yes, it can be instantaneous, but it's usually rather small things. If it's something bigger, if it's a bigger orchestration, it does take a little bit more time. And that is there for our own protection, because I think that while we're still in this process of ascension, having instant manifestation is not necessarily the best thing, especially if you're going through shadow work. Back then, if you're having almost instant manifestation and you decide to manifest in the negative, so to speak, so you're using negative energy in order to manifest, then yeah, those curses can and did happen. I have actually cleared quite a few of those in order to allow the person to have more sovereignty and not have to live with that curse. Do curses affect us now? Not as much as they did back then, but ultimately the energy you still don't want hanging around in your field anyway. The other thing that I have seen in another client session was that this person was actually, in fact, one of the persecutors. She was actually somebody who was putting all of these women to death. And there was one person specifically that this person had a particular relationship with. And we went through the process, and I could actually see my client standing in the courtroom accusing this other woman. And the intensity and the relationship between the two of them was quite significant, to the point where it was obvious that the person doing the accusing, which was my client in that previous lifetime, was in fact either in love with the woman or there was some sort of attachment there. And she had basically spurned his advances. And so he got incredibly angry. So that's why she was actually on trial. Through the course of the session, we actually ended up asking for forgiveness from him, basically from himself, the person that my client was in that particular lifetime, and the forgiveness of all of the women that he had executed during that lifetime. It's interesting because I hadn't seen that prior to that, because most of the light workers that I had seen had incarnated as people who received their gifts. Well, this particular light worker decided to incarnate on the other side. I believe that this was sort of later on in the witch trials. I feel like this was a decision that this person's soul had made in order to have this experience. Now, this is not something that we actually touched on. This is sort of an afterthought. It is one of those things where I was thinking, now that I have all of this information from all of these different sessions, it all kind of starts coming together like a big puzzle. Whereas that session was very early on in my discovery of this subject matter. As I've gotten more and more information, I've started to see, oh, okay, so now I understand why this is said in history and why this person incarnated the way that they did and why this person has the blocks that they do. I hope you have found this as fascinating as I find it. I love absorbing all of this information and hearing all of the things that my guides want to tell me about what happened back then, and specifically during that time, because it was such a very, very pivotal time for us light workers, because a lot of us abused the powers and because a lot of us couldn't handle the powers. It is why that veil of forgetfulness was sort of replaced upon us until such time as, well, now, where we are now able to more slowly come into our gifts, more slowly come into the awareness of who we truly are. And with that slow patience also comes mastery. In my opinion, I'm glad that it's happening the way that it is now, because it does allow us the ability and the time to really master the things that we need to master. Thank you so much for joining me. Have a wonderful holiday, and I will see you next week. If you have any stories or you have seen in your own Akashic Record readings that you have had lifetimes during this time period and you have something to share, please feel free to email me at annette@infinitesoullove.com. And you can also reach me on my website, infinitesoullove.com, and on all social media, Infinite Soul Love 1111. If you would like to book an Akashic Record session with me, you can book it directly on my website. And I hope you have an amazing week.
This episode of The Heart of You was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, please join us on Patreon.